So we will look at India's Danish connection in all its warts and its glory. But before that, just a little interlude. Mumbai has had a long relationship with the Danes. There have been many prominent Danes who have been to Mumbai and instrumental in the history of the city. So not many of you will know about Rasmus Rask, one of the earliest Danish travelers to India. Those who are familiar with Elephanta will know Carsten Niebuhr very well. He was one of the first Westerners to make elaborate drawings of the caves at Elephanta. Henning Hol Clarkson and Soren Tubro, we know very well. Their name is plastered all over construction sites, wherever the metro is being built, where there are flyovers and various other things. And of course, a lot of us will know, some of us very personally, the historian of Bombay, Foy Nissen. But this talk will happen far, far away from Mumbai at a place called Tranquebar, and I've structured it to be reminiscent of all the Norse sagas. So many sagas were collected into cycles of sagas. So I've decided that the history of the Danish occupation of Tranquebar, I will present it like a whole bunch of Norse sagas. So let's move to the first cycle. But before that, the history of Tranquebar is only a few years, 230 years of its entire history is Danish. It has a much, much longer history under various other rulers. Okay, the place is known as Tranquebar. The spelling Quebar, as we know it, comes to us from the Portuguese. Its actual Tamil word is Tarangambadi. It has not very far from the Danish settlement an extremely beautiful Pandya period temple with multiple inscriptions suggesting that it was a trading hub for a very, very long time, long before its now almost permanent association with the Danes. So it is a storied town, and the name Tarangambadi means the place of the waves. Taranga in Sanskrit meaning wave. So we come to the first cycle at a time when the various East India companies had been formed. So, those of you who are familiar with the colonial trade, you know that the East India Company got its charter on the 31st of December, 1600, to trade with India as a monopoly. And it remained a royal company. The royal family was the stakeholder in it alongside a whole lot of other bankers. Its competitors were a large number of Dutch companies, together known as the Compagnie. And in 1602, the States General of the United Netherlands force merged them to form what is known as the Verenigde Ostindische Kompagni, or the United East India Company. And these two were among the biggest competitors for the entire, what is known as the East Asia trade, or the trade with the East Indies. Alongside them, of course, you have the French East India Company, a sort of third place holder. And then the also rans of the Danish and the Swedish East India companies. The Portuguese never really formed a company, but had a very, very strong colonial presence before these two companies. And they had been in Asia for about a century and a quarter before these two caught up with them. The seventh voyage of the East India Company. Okay, so in the initial period, they often had flotillas of ships that sailed out of Europe, made the perilous crossing of the Cape of Good Hope, came to India, did their trading, and when the winds changed, they would go back. So these are called voyages. And the first voyage of the Portuguese was very instrumental in triggering this, you might call it an arms race, for they made one of the biggest killings in the European market, selling Indian spices at a much, much lower rate compared to what the Venetians were then selling in Europe. The Venetians having the monopoly over trade with the Arabs. And subsequently, the other companies started making a killing. Between 1611 and 1615, the English East India Company made its seventh voyage, and the total investment into that voyage had been 15,634 pounds. Okay. The return that they got on that investment was a staggering 214%. I will leave it to you to calculate how much that was. But this made news all over the capitals of Europe. Now, many of the kings were particularly not interested in this colonial trade. So while the French, the Spanish and Portuguese were a little more focused on the West Indies, that is the Americas, while the French, English, and Dutch were competing heavily for the East Indies or Asia. Africa at that point of time still did not interest a lot of them until much later when the famous scramble for Africa took place. But one of the kings who was very certainly interested in trade was Christian IV. So he realized that his kingdom, while strategically located between the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, as well as Germany, was heavily dependent on trade from the Baltics, passing into the North Sea. And the Strait of Copenhagen, which is extremely narrow and through which all the Baltic trade passed, was a major source of his funds. But otherwise, Denmark was largely an agricultural country, okay, and he was clearly a little more interested in making more money. And he decided that if everyone was making tons of money off the East Asia trade, why can I also not do so? He entertained two Dutchmen. Now, the thing with the Dutch was this. The Dutch were prime rivals of the English. But after 1602, all the Dutch trade had been consolidated under the VOC. And not all Dutch traders were necessarily happy with this arrangement. Two of these traders were Jan de Willem of Amsterdam and Herman Rosencrantz of Rotterdam. So when they sort of got the news that Christian IV was also interested in figuring a fleet to go to the Asiatic trade, they went and proposed to him that we will form a Danish trading company. And he accordingly granted them a charter, forming the first Danish East India Company. And the date is March the 17th, 1616. Okay, which was to have a monopoly on trade between Denmark and Asia. However, for them to actually kit out a fleet and send it to India was another matter altogether. So Christian and his partners, Jan de Willem and Herman Rosencrantz, took another couple of years to manage to raise the capital to be able to kit out a fleet and send it. Meanwhile, what had happened? The next year, in 1617, he received a very strange embassy. Okay, one certain Marcellus de Beaucheveur appeared at his court, okay, carrying what he said was a letter from the Emperor of Ceylon. Okay, which was no emperor as such, but it was the King of Kandy at that time, So this is the Sri Lanka of that time. The green bits are the bits that were under direct Portuguese rule, and the rest was independent Sri Lanka. And he was trying to get the Portuguese out. And apparently, he had appointed this Marceli de Beauchauva, who was one of the various adventurers and fortune seekers floating around in Asia, sometimes patronized by these companies, sometimes working against the companies. Those a lot of you will have heard of very interesting names such as Constantine Falcon and others. So here was this guy who apparently got a letter from the Sri Lankan king, and he had not been entertained in multiple capitals until he arrived in Copenhagen, and the Danes were willing to give him an audience, and pretending to be the representative of the King of Ceylon, he signed a trade treaty giving the Danes monopoly over the Ceylon trade. Okay. In return, apparently, the King of Ceylon would supply $90,000 to the King of the Danes, the exclusive right to trade for 12 years. In return, the Danes were to supply him with ships and some 300 soldiers to push the Portuguese out. Okay, so a ship called the Öresund finally set sail from Copenhagen on August the 18th, 1618. One thing I love about these colonial narratives is that they have all the dates set down in stone. But that's about the few things that you have to love about it. So one Roland Krappe, a Dutch captain, was appointed to lead this expedition. So that expedition, with this Öresund as the scout ship sailing ahead, is followed by the main fleet, which set out on November the 29th. It had 4 Danish ships. They were called the Christian and the Copenhagen, with the flagship Elephant and a warship accompanying them called David. And the admiral was, who was he was 24 years old, son of a nobleman. His name was Ove Gedde. But because of the class system, he was like parachuted to the rank of admiral. And he led the main expedition. So the expedition reached Ceylon in 1620, having sailed for nearly 2 years. Now, the Öresund, being the scout ship, having set out several months earlier, obviously arrived first. And Roland Krappe discovered that whatever power Senarat had further oozed away to the Portuguese. So the Senarat that he found was even weaker. But Krappe then, unfortunately, took a somewhat more hasty decision and attacked the Portuguese without waiting for the rest of the Danish fleet, which obviously landed in disaster. The Portuguese sunk his ship and kidnapped him or took him prisoner to their settlement in Nagapattinam, where they kept him a prisoner. Okay. But the problem was now Krappe was no novice. Krappe was a Dutchman, as you know, and he had been floating around in this area. And one of the friends that he had was the Nayak of Tanjavur, Raghunath Nayak. Krappe managed to get a message across to Raghunath Nayaka that the Portuguese have kidnapped me. And Nayak immediately sent an ultimatum to them that there will be action if you don't let go of him. And therefore, Krappe was released to the Tanjavur court. While this was happening, Ove Gedde brought I hope I'm pronouncing the names right. If I'm not apologizing. The main Danish fleet arrived. Now this Busho guy, by the way, died on the journey. So there was no one who would be able to say, yeah, we know this guy, and yes, this document is right. Okay, the king of Kandy flatly refused to recognize the treaty that Bushowa had signed with the king of Denmark. Said, I don't know this guy, and I very certainly do not um, honor this treaty at all. And I'm certainly not going to give you $90,000. I don't have anything like that kind of money. Okay. But faced with the fact that he had a lot of four armed Danish ships on his, on his eastern shore, because the western shore was under the Portuguese, he decided to hand over Trincomalee to them. Okay, which you see here in the northeast of Sri Lanka. And he said, you guys can set up your little factory there. Okay, Krappe sitting in Tanjavur heard of this and then said, you guys, why don't you come here? This kingdom is more, is independent, less embattled, certainly not as vulnerable to the Portuguese as Kandy is, and you have a better chance here. So the Danish fleet then went over to the Tanjavur kingdom, and the king of Tanjavur, Raghunath Naik, gave them the village of Tarangambadi, okay, just north of the Park Strait, as a little colony. So they said, you guys can build a fortress and a factory in this little village. And that was it. And the Danish admiral, I mean, when he had said sail, he was only 24, as I told you. No, not further interested. This is climate that none of them had encountered. Okay. The Danes complain that it is getting very hot when it reaches 20 degrees Celsius. And these are places where the normal temperature is 35 degrees Celsius. So post haste, he just dashed back to Denmark, where then he would have a major career and never to be heard of again. Okay, but he is often credited as the founder of the colony of Tranquebar for really all the efforts of Roland Crappe, but that's what you get when you're a commoner and the opposite member is a nobleman. So the Danish flag is finally planted in India. Okay, this is a view of the Pandya period temple from the Danish fort. Okay, as I said, a very beautiful temple. It has multiple inscriptions which talk of traders from many countries coming and trading here. So Tarangambadi was already an important port long before the other had come. There are mentions of Arabs, Southeast Asians, and various other communities who have traded at Tarangambadi for several centuries before 1616. Okay. Now let's look at the saga of Roland Crappe and how he managed to make of the deal that he got. Okay, here is the treaty that was signed. So on top is in Telugu the version of the treaty on gold leaf. Okay, now in the National Archives of Denmark and the national treasure of that country. And below that on paper is the treaty which was written in Portuguese. Because that was the common trading language at that point of time. Okay, so under Roland Crappe served as the first governor. Okay, now the date given to us. Okay, very interesting. As per this gold leaf, it is the Raudra year, Chitrai month, 20th, which in the Georgian calendar roughly comes to April the 25th of 1620. Okay, the Portuguese treaty dates to the 20th of November 1620. Part of the agreement was that 2,000 chakrams the chakram being the common currency of that period across all the Nayaka domains, Travancore, and other southern kingdoms, which roughly translates to rupees 3,111 in terms of the Mughal rupee currency. That was the tribute agreed upon, and the Danish colony had to pay this tribute annually on Vijayadashmi Day to Raghunath Nayak. Okay. While they agreed to this, as most of the expedition had gone back home, Krappe had little cash, and he was forced to sell some of his guns to raise the cash to be able to build the little fort that he did have. Okay. So the first full-time governor of Tranquebar, he started expanding Danish presence in India, and so you can see the Danish flag appears in various other parts of the country. Okay. He first decided to have, from his safe harbor at Tranquebar, he set up another factory at Masulipattnam, okay, or modern Machilipatnam, which was in those days one of the most important port of the Mughals, especially the Subedars of the Dakhan, who would later be known as the Nizams. And he also had other trading ports at Pipli and Balasore to try and deal with the Nawabs of Bengal and Orissa. So, under Krappe, they followed the same modus operandi as what the French, the English, and the Dutch were doing in negotiating little deals, setting up factories where ships could come. Each factory had its own godown, so things were bought locally, stored in the godown, and when the ships turned up, they were to be purchased. Now, the Danes were trading the same things as the Dutch were doing. See, they were basically Dutch ships under Dutch merchants trading in the Danish flag. Right? So they were just doing the same thing as the VOC, but without, without coming under the Dutch monopoly, because individual Dutch traders were forbidden to trade outside of the VOC. So a lot of what they were doing were buying South Indian textiles, loading them onto their ship. The ships were then being sent to places in the East Indies like Makassar, where they were then buying cloves and various other spices. Those ships were rushing off then to Copenhagen, selling the stuff there. Okay, then buying a number of European goods and coming back to Travancore. So, sorry, to Tranquebar. So this would be the general pattern being followed for the next 200 years. So they would have appeared as normal a colonial group as the rest. But that does not make history interesting. Yeah, so this is the general route. Okay, buying things along the coast of India, going into Southeast Asia, and then loading up all those spices, running to Europe and coming back. Okay. One of the big ports that they were dealing with was Tenasserim, as we say it in modern English, Tanintari in Burmese, but in those days it was under the control of Thailand. Okay. The Nayak gave them a letter of introduction saying, I know the king of Thailand very well. We already have trade relationships. Okay. So here's a large cargo of textiles for the king and his people in Thailand. And in return, I wanted to bring back rice and elephants. Okay. So a lot of Thai elephants were imported into India for the use in their battles and their temple rituals and royal deeds and all. And that was a big aspect of trade between Thailand and India. Indian textiles were in huge demand all across Southeast Asia. And in return, they bought rice, they bought spices, they bought elephants and other things. Okay. Now the Danes, a lot of good reason for the Danes to be here was because they were largely neutral in most of the fights in Europe going on. So remember, once the ships reached Gibraltar, after that, the Straits of Gibraltar, and then the ships were going up via the coast of Portugal, Spain, France. Then they got all mired in whatever random battles were going on in Europe. And for a whole lot of them, the Danish flag was very important because it was a neutral flag. And I will come to that. So Makassar, which was under the control of the Danes, they were very jealous of it that no one can trade at Makassar apart from the Danes. Similarly at Bantam. And that they would actively kill any European who tried to set foot there who was not Dutch. Okay. Only the Danes managed to sort of escape that gauntlet. Okay. Also largely because of Roland Krappe's own personal connections. And he sort of had persuaded them that these are, we are just Dutch bhai. So Krappe commanded one of the first voyages to Makassar, trading in textiles from Tanjore for the spices of Makassar. Okay. And then they came back to Tranquebar. The ships went further ahead via the Cape of Good Hope to Copenhagen while Krappe stayed back. So all of that was there. Another trading point was Bantam, but by the 1660s, the Dutch had become sort of so jealous that they shut off the trade, and the Danes were now, whatever promise they had and whatever potential they saw at Tranquebar had evaporated. In 1636, Krappe was replaced as governor by a fellow called Barent Pessart. Pessart was everything that Krappe was not. Okay, Pessart decided that he will live not in Tranquebar with its poor little Maharaja, but in Masulipatnam under the shadow of the great Sultan of Golconda. Okay, but Pessart also lived a very high life and was not the kind that would bother with accounts. So, in just 2 years, when he was governor of the Danish settlement, he had run up huge debts and embarrassed the Danes. So they weren't even able to pay the annual tribute that they had to give to Thanjavur. Okay, and the Sultan of Golconda decided to take him hostage until the Danes paid up his debts. But what did the Danes do? It almost awoke the dormant Viking blood in them. So the Danes at Tranquebar captured a ship belonging to Mir Muhammad Syed Ardastani, who was a very wealthy merchant and got a large shipping fleet of his own, which was trading with Arabia and Southeast Asia. And they said that we won't release this ship until Pessart is released. Okay, so Ardastani, not wanting to let go of his trade, decided that Pessart's debts were a small price to pay. So he paid off Pessart's ransom. Pessart was released. Okay. But the Mughals were so pissed at this arrangement and the Sultans of Golconda that the Danes were thrown out of Machilipatnam. Okay. It also led to a reputation that these white people are not to be dealt with. And while a lot of Europeans protested that the Danes don't talk for all of us, to all the Indians, it was like, all of you whites are the same. How are we to know who's Dutch, who's Danish? Okay. So the damage that Pessart caused led to a lot of trouble down the years for everybody who was trading on the Bay of Bengal. But Pessart wasn't done yet. Okay. In 1643, the Danes appointed yet another Dutchman called William Lyle as the governor. But Pesat, now, forced to operate out of Tranquebar, shut him out. He said, I am not alikarowing this place. Okay. Lael was forced to lay siege to his own citadel. Okay. Finally, Pesat fled, but before he fled, he had this arrangement with the Portuguese that the fort's guns, money, and books were all taken by Pesat. So when William landed, he had a huge mess on his hands. So Lael essentially had to rebuild Tranquebar from the start again. Okay. Plus, he had to rebuild his credit with the Mughals, with Golconda, with Raghunath Naik, with everybody else. Okay. Also, Raghunath Naik passed away. His successor had come, Vijay Raghavan Naik. Okay, who wasn't as keen on this foreign trade as his predecessor was. Okay. But Lael discovered that there wasn't any money. Okay, they had been shut out of the effectively been shut out of the East India trade. The debts that Pesat had built up were terrible. He was not able to answer the accounts to the company directors back home. So now how are we going to make money? Okay. So he went back to the one strategy they knew had worked in the past, which was privateering. Lael and his few troopers again started plundering the Mughal and Sultanate ships that were passing by. And Lael had discovered two things. One is how weak the Indian navies were, especially the navies of the Mughals. Okay. And how very easily the Indians would rather just pay up to solve a problem rather than fight it out. So under Lael, a large number of such privateering incidents started to get reported. Okay, and to the Mughals, these were all Christians. Now, they all looked the same. So the damage that Pesat had caused, instead of, Lael had first attempt to repair it, but then he discovered that this was the only means of making the colony survive, and hence this was the only way forward. But eventually, Lael realized that he had to make peace with all these Indians if the longevity of the colony was to be assured. So he signed peace treaties, but that angered his men, who said, now if we are not privateering, how are we making money for ourselves? Making money for Denmark is all good and fine. So they mutinied against Lael. Okay. And imprisoned him. And then after some negotiation, Lael was allowed to board a Dutch ship and go Denmark. The colony effectively became independent of Denmark. The person who replaced Lael was the leader of the mutineers, a guy called Paul Hansen Porser. Okay. And he decided that privateering did not have to be restricted to the Mughals. Okay. So he started attacking even the Dutch and the English ships and the Portuguese ships and the French ships. Okay. All that said, that only united all the others against him. There were more armed convoys subsequently trading up and down the Bay of Bengal. So Tranquebar was effectively running bankrupt. Okay. So eventually Korsar decided that the only way forward was to just sell off Tranquebar to the Dutch and go home. But the Dutch said, no, thank you, we're not interested. He died in 1655 or so, by which time the number of Danish people surviving in India had already dropped a lot. The senior most of the surviving Danes there was a guy called Eskil Andersen Kongsbach. And after a few years, he would become the last surviving Dane east of Africa. Kongsberg was clever. So that was the effective end of the company. Uh, Kongsberg, however, had married a local Tamil woman, was a good speaker of Tamil, and essentially he turned the little colony of Tarangambadi or Tranquebar into a sort of pirate republic, independent of everybody else, okay, under danger to all the shipping on the Bay of Bengal. And it was, I mean, he was Danish but married to a Tamil lady, leading a fleet of essentially Tamil pirates, and that's how Tranquebar was getting along. Also, what happened was the East India Company of the Danes was not a particularly lucky company. It was plagued with shipwrecks. So all the ships assigned to it, not by 1627, only 3 ships were ever surviving. The little that it did, however, it made a lot of money. So it had been a successful company doing about 7 voyages. Many of the routes to Southeast Asia became unsustainable because the Dutch were blockading them. Okay. To further their misery, their chief patron, Christian IV, had died, and Frederick III, who was his successor, had no interest in the Asiatic trade. This is also mixed up with a history of wars on the European continent, which we will not have the scope to go into, and therefore this Danish presence effectively came to an end. The company went bankrupt in 1650, so just 34 years, and that was the end of the first Danish East India. But as I said, the settlement here had already become independent. The company had long ceased to exist. Okay. However, as long as they paid off the Nayaks at Tanjore, they were free to do what they pleased. And so they carried on being a pirate republic. Okay. And from 1655 to 1670, that's what they would be. Kongsberg, the only Dane there, a white king of brown people. Okay. Sounds pretty romantic. Okay. There were times when Tranquebar could not pay the tribute to Tanjore, at which point the Tanjore army would lay siege. But Tranquebar had superior guns. I mean, it was ruled by a gunner, and every time they could withstand the siege. And so this was a full-on, now you could say, Viking state in the Bay of Bengal, but effectively a Tamil Viking state. Okay. Eventually, though, Kongsberg got tired. He said, I can't hold on any longer. Okay. I am also now, mera bhi time aa raha hai. So he sent an emissary. So he got hold of a Dutch guy, Geert van Hagen, at Nagapattinam, and he sent a letter to Copenhagen saying, Kuch to karo. Do something about your colony here at Tranquebar. So the Danish government then decided that kuch to karenge. And in 1669, a ship arrived in Tranquebar, okay, with a letter where the king formally appointed Kongsberg as the governor of Tranquebar. And there was a guy called Henrik Eggers who brought some Danish soldiers with him, and Eggers was appointed as the deputy governor. However, Eggers quickly managed to sideline Kongsberg. He said, look, Kongsberg is low born. He's just an ordinary gunner. I'm of a more noble family. Okay. And of course, Egger had the armed soldiers, trained armed soldiers with him against Kongsberg's sort of loosely trained militia. So eventually, Kongsberg was sidelined. We don't even know where he is buried today. So the Danish cemetery in Tranquebar has Kongsberg's grave, but it is an unmarked. Now, this is the end of the first cycle. Okay. So by around 1695, this is what Tranquebar looked like. So this is the original fort known as Fort Dansborg. And Kongsbacher had built a much larger outer fortification. Today, this one is in a great state of preservation. It has been lovingly restored by Intag and the Danes, and a lot of money, of course. Okay. But Kongsbach's outer wall that marked the entire city of Tranquebar is in very poor condition. Only one gate survives. Okay, this is the beach where ships would land. This is this is the river, and this is the beach where ships would land. And ships would come here, and then some ships could sail in river. So this is oriented in the tradition of maps of that period to the east. So east is actually facing up, and that's how the word oriented literally comes from. Okay, and many of the streets of Tranquebar are still as laid out by Kongsbach. Okay, it had a European quarter and a native quarter. So this is how the fort looks like. Okay, from one side. Korsor had built a different house outside the fort. So he didn't want to stay inside the fort. So he stayed here. And the house is still standing. It has been restored and is under use by the Lutheran Church. Okay. But as I said, with the letter sent by Kongsbach, this was the end of the first company cycle. Okay. Now, the second cycle comes in a period of war. So now you have to figure that by 1639, okay, the Portuguese have been edged out of Ceylon by the Dutch. And also the English have arrived and set up a big factory of their own at Madras. Okay, the Portuguese are here at Pondicherry. And while their stars are rising, the stars of the Dutch and the Portuguese are setting. And the Danes are caught in between all of this. To give you some context, there are further changes of winds. By 1649, the Nayak of Jinji, which was a small kingdom to the north of Tanjore, had been overthrown by the Sultanate of Bijapur, so they had come as far that the Tanjore Nayaks were themselves under some threat. In 1673, there was a major war between the Tanjore Nayaks and the Madura Nayaks, okay, which the Madura Nayaks won. But Tanjore was then invaded by Venkoji or Ekoji the First, Shivaji's half brother. And in 1674, Venkoji became king of Tanjore, and therefore now the rulership at Tanjore had also changed. The Danes were now in a much more limited position, and the Dutch had essentially faded away, but not yet. Okay. So also, Frederick III had died. His son Christian V had come into power. And in 1670, he decided to revive his grandfather's initiative. And so he set up the second Danish East India Company. He made a new treaty with the rulers of Tanjore. Okay. He also sent a treaty to the Mughals in Bengal and offered to end the entire culture of privateering once and for all. And so the Viking saga of the Danes in the Bay of Bengal was put to an end. Okay. Instead, under the new governors, okay, who are somewhat far more sedate men, not the colorful characters that you've seen in the first cycle. They set about setting new factories, and one major factory is set up here at Gondalpada near Calcutta under the name of Denmark's Nagore, okay, which is today called Dilmardanga, okay, a remnant of that name, alongside the others. And they also try to establish trading posts with Malabar. So these are the Danes, and apparently they had one settlement, one factory or warehouse at Parangipete, but that is disputed. So the historicity of that is not well established. Okay, so the second company is trying to carry on the old trade. They were doing the same thing. So from Copenhagen to Tranquebar, they were bringing a large number of luxury goods from Europe, especially which was sought after by the European expats. So they were selling things not so much to the Indians as much as to the English, French, whoever was in India for the trade and craving European goods. And also a lot of tax differences. So they were basically a sort of tax haven. Then at Tranquebar, they were loading up with a lot of textiles. So basically buying things from Tamil weavers and taking them to Bantam, to Manila, to Aceh, etc. So Manila was then, under Spanish control, but there was like a joint Danish-French trading rights were available. And then they were taking spices and especially pepper and sapan, redwood and bamboo, and they were taking these to Europe. So this was the basic trade journey that the Danes were doing at this point of time. However, again, as the Dutch felt threatened, they again tried to shut them out. Now you will see Aceh here, and one of the things that Aceh wanted badly was slaves from India. And so the Danes sort of resorted to that, and they bought up both from Bengal and from Tranquebar a number of lower caste people who were sold off into slavery and shipped off across the Bay of Bengal to work in Aceh and to perish there. Okay, so in 1694, 1695, and 1696, they have logs of these trades where they had sold Indian slaves into Aceh. So that was the rather terrible slave trade. Okay, so this is Tranquebar as of the 1730s. Okay, so you still see Fort Dansborg, the new governor's house that has come up outside. This is the esplanade. The walls built by Kongsberg, okay, and various other streets and other things that have been laid out. So it hasn't really expanded from the time of Kongsberg. It hasn't become a bigger settlement. Meanwhile, Pondicherry and Chennai are growing and growing and growing. Okay. But the Danish East India Company managed to build for itself lavish headquarters in Copenhagen. What happened to these, I will tell you. Okay. Now we come to the Swedish saga and the end of the second cycle. Okay. In 1699, Christian V died. His successor was Frederick IV, who got involved in the Great Northern War with the Swedes. Okay. And the war completely depleted his treasury. Because of the war, especially in the Danish straits, a lot of the shipping of Copenhagen had been disrupted. And by 1720, the company had become bankrupt again. Okay. They kept trying this way, that way, but by 1729, they gave up, and that was the end of the second Danish East India. First one was privateering, the second one was slave trade. Okay, so now we come to the third cycle, and the Danes took one more shot at being a colonial power. Okay, but this is a time of war and lots more war. Okay, so a full list of wars in which the Danes were often players, often just, how do I say, bystanders, but they made full advantage of that. So who was it? Frederick IV died and Christian VI came to power. Now you're beginning to see a pattern. When there is a Christian, there is a company. When there is a Frederick, there is the end of the company. So Christian VI was also inspired by his grandfather and his great-great-grandfather. And so he set up a new company in 1732 called the Danish Asiatic Company. So they decided that maybe the word Ostindisk was a bit of a Panvati, so they changed the name and they said we call it the Danish Asiatic Company. And he gave it monopoly rights for 40 years. And it turned out to be the most profitable venture for them yet. Okay. Copenhagen became a very important center for trading East Asian goods, both from India as well as Southeast Asia as well as China. Okay. Now, how did the company do this? Okay. It was very simple. They said anyone who's willing to pay us a cut or a commission, okay, can run their ship under our flag. So you can trade with any part of Asia, okay, and you can pretend to be a Danish ship. So you fly the Dannebrog on your ship, which means that instead of going to your home port, either in France or in England or in Netherlands, your ship goes all the way to Copenhagen because it is pretending to be a Danish ship trading in Asia. Okay, you sell your goods in Copenhagen, and then on the land route, you can take it to your respective country and sell the goods there. So they had become essentially the Switzerland of the Bay of Bengal. Okay, anyone wanted to do, dodge taxes, dodge company monopoly. Okay, you were free to trade at Tranquebar and its sister colony at Serampore. So the Danes had long since given up their colony at Danmarksnagar, but subsequently they decided to get a new colony near Calcutta at a place called Serampore, which they called Frederiksnagar, which is today known as Serampore or Sriram. And the Asiatic Company set up its headquarters. The headquarters is still standing on the site of the old East India Company headquarters. Okay. Now part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs sits in this place. Okay, and they've retained a couple of ships here just for that historic memory. Under the Asiatic Company, they started trading with the kings of Travancore at Colachel, with the kings of Calicut. Okay, they also made a brief attempt at colonizing the Nicobar Islands, which they call the Frederick Islands. They set up colonies at Balasore, but the one that would last the longest among all of them is still Tranquebar and Frederiksnagar or Serampore. Another view of Fort Dansborg, okay, practically unchanged in its plan. Okay, one of the governors, Paul Krisk Punk, okay, had grown up in Tranquebar. And when he became governor of Tranquebar, he said, I have my house. I will stay outside the fort. The fort is too stuffy a place. I was brought up among all these local people. I am happy to stay with them. So that became the new governor's house. That is also still standing. It's now called the Commandant's Farm. Okay. A new governor called Brown bought a new house. Okay. So this is the new governor's mansion. It is also still standing. When Tranquebar was handed over to the British, it was later converted into the Salt Commissioner's office and warehouse. It has also been restored and is now a hotel. So now the action moves from Tranquebar to Serampore. So even though the governor is sitting at Tranquebar, the actual action is happening at Serampore. What is this action? Nothing. Okay. So the Dutch are here at Chinsura, right? There are others at Chandanagar. The French are at Chandanagar. Okay. The Portuguese are at Hooghly. And of course, the East India Company at Calcutta proper. But these companies have official monopolies from their governments. But a lot of traders do not want to directly operate as employees of the East India Company. And many employees of the East India Company also found that they could do their own private little trades. They could make cut deals with the with the Nawab at Murshidabad, with various other zamindars, okay, buy up a lot of goods on their private things, kit out a ship, okay. But now you cannot sail under your own flag. So you turn up at Serampore, you cut a deal with the Danes. They give you a letter for the guys at Copenhagen. You hoist the Danish flag on your ship and you sail out pretending to be a Danish ship sailing out from Serampore. And because Denmark was largely neutral in many of these European wars, they had to let the Danish ships through, especially passing the English Channel on their way to Copenhagen, where neither the English nor the Dutch could fire at you. So if it was Dutch shipping, the English were attacking Dutch shipping, which was headed to Amsterdam. If it was English shipping, the Dutch were attacking English shipping headed to London. And therefore, for a lot of people, having a Danish flag was safe because you passed right through the middle of these navies all the way to Copenhagen. And then by land, you could sell goods into Sweden, to Germany, to Russia, whoever was willing to buy. Okay, so this is largely at Serampore. Still a lot of Danish buildings standing. Okay, the Denmark Tavern, the South Gate, the Church of St. Olaf, and the famous Serampore College. Okay, so that brings us to almost the closing chapter. So 1757, right? You have the famous Battle of Pilashi. The British have taken over the Diwani of Bengal. All the other colonials are in trouble because the British power is rising. And in 1756, again the Danes fell short of the tribute that they had to give to the king of Tanjore. There was a brief battle because the Tanjore marched on Tranquebar. There was a brief battle which was repulsed, but the Danes lost about 50 killed, 100 wounded. There was also quite a large casualties among the Tanjore people. Okay, but the British were now in full ascendancy and they were very suspicious of the Danes. This was also a time when the British were fighting, okay, and Mysore was aligned to the French. Okay, both the French and the British were also fighting among themselves. So this is, the Carnatic wars were happening at this point of time. So sometimes the French, rather than landing at Pondicherry, would land their arms and armaments at Tranquebar. Okay, because Pondicherry was being blockaded by the British. The British would do the same thing when the French were blockading them. They would also land at Tranquebar. Okay, so this neutral status of Tranquebar started coming under fire. Okay, on top of it, even Hyder Ali sent them an ultimatum that how on earth are you allowing the British to land their goods here? Hyder Ali threatened to march on Tranquebar. Tranquebar had to agree to give him a fine of 14,000 pounds to retain its independence. Okay, but clearly the Danes were in trouble again. Okay, so we come to the end of the DAK as well, by which time essentially the British had completely, chewed up everyone. So in 1777, the DAK was also wound up and Tranquebar became a Danish crown colony. Okay. Further, all these Carnatic wars and the Mysore wars had ruined the countryside. The productivity had crashed. The pepper that they needed to trade with Southeast Asia and with Europe, the textiles that they needed, and everything else was everything in short supply. The company came to a sad end and Denmark became a crown colony. Okay. But this is the entire colony of Tranquebar. Okay. See that the main settlement with Fort Dansborg and Kongsberg's outer walls is only a very small part of the colony. There are several other villages and agricultural land in this entire colony. Okay, this brown thing marks its actual boundary. That was what it was. Okay, after 1815, only 5 ships would ever come to Tranquebar. Okay, the DAK sort of forgot Tranquebar. It focused more on the trade with Bengal and China. But unfortunately, even that declined. And finally, in 1845, for about 4,10,000 pounds sterling, the Danes sold off all their possessions in India, Serampore and Tranquebar, to the British, and that was the end of Danish. Tranquebar, they tried to retain the Nicobar Islands, but in 1868, they gave that up also. Okay, and so that was the final saga. Okay, this is how Tarangambadi looks today. Okay, this is the full Fort Danske, okay, with its stables and its observatory. Okay, this is the river meeting the sea at this end. This is the esplanade of the fort. There have been archaeological excavations and a few coins and other things have been found. Okay, this is a map of all of Tranquebar drawn up by intact. Okay, very few of the fortifications really still survive today. Okay, so most of the churches built by them survive. Okay, this is the land gate, one of the few surviving things. This is of 2017. I don't know what its state is today. Okay, this is Fort Dansborg with its 4 little bastions that were named after Prince Frederick, the Queen, Prince Christian, and the King. Okay, the main palace within the fort has a little site museum in it. Okay, and this is how it looks as it is. Okay, with a little cemetery outside. Okay, with a ramp for lading goods. The warehouse is within the fort. Okay, that was obviously their most precious possession. So the warehouse is within the fort. Okay. A lot of restoration work has been done after the 2004 tsunami. Okay. The upper level, it has a little museum. This is the warehouse. It had its own little prison as well. Okay. Few things in the museum and the kind of things that they were trading in. Okay. They also have a full list of ships based on the records of the 3 companies. Okay. Each ship, when it sailed to and fro Tranquebar. Okay. The old governor's house. Okay. Now restored. Okay. This is the governor's house of David Brown, the English guy who became governor of Tranquebar. But Tranquebar was a very, very, to use a very modern word, cosmopolitan settlement. It had many Indian communities, especially Tamil and Telugu speaking communities, a huge number of castes, which they tried to manage by having native law govern the native people and European laws governing the Europeans. So all Europeans were under Danish law, but a lot of Portuguese, English, French, Dutch chose to live in Tranquebar and operate out of it somewhat more lenient rules rather than other colonial settlements there. Okay, so the governor's house is a mixture of nice Coromandel plus European architecture. Okay, this is a photograph from the time when it was being used as a salt commissioner's office. Okay, this is the New Jerusalem Lutheran Church. They were the local Tamil people were called Malabars. Malabar is a name often used for Indians by the Arabs, Portuguese, Dutch, and others. So the people were often called Malabars. It's a lovely cross-shaped church. Okay. Called the New Jerusalem Church. Okay. So this is another house belonging to the former engineer Mohlendorf. Okay. another church. So this was the European church. And the last thing about Tranquebar, by the way, there is a printing press, which is, there was a publishing house called Tranquebar for a few years. I think it has since closed down. But Tranquebar is the one that brought the printing press to India. The first Tamil books were printed in Tranquebar by a guy called Bartholomew Ziegelbalg. So a Danish missionary of the Lutheran Church who came here to preach and was one of the first to bring a printing press, and he set up a Tamil printing font and type and everything. So the first few Tamil books to be printed all come out of Tranquebar. Subsequently, of course, the printing press sort of spread, and other people also learned to use the Tamil print, to print Hindu texts. So then that is a completely different history. But yes, Tranquebar, for its very colored history, is also its permanent legacy is the introduction of the printing press to the Tamil language. Thank you very much.